Retro.
Are you an aspiring Jedi, or do you dabble with the dark side of the Force?
Regardless of whether you fancy yourself a defender of the light or an aspiring Sith Lord, you're going to need a lightsaber.
Podcast Stardust is pleased to partner with Saber Masters, the creators of high-quality, durable, and affordable lightsabers.
Saber Masters is preparing to launch the Ultimate Lightsaber 2.0, and right now you can get 2 for the price of 1.
So, check out the link in our show notes and go get your Ultimate Lightsabers from Saber Masters.
And don't forget to use our referral code Stardust to save $10 at checkout.
And each purchase using our referral code helps support Podcast Stardust.
Hello there. This is James Arnold Taylor, the voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and you're listening to Dennis and Jay on Podcast Stardust. Their behavior is continuously unexpected. So uncivilized.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And it's Monday, and we are starting a periodic rewatch of the Clone Wars with this episode. But before we dive into that, Jay, I want to remind everybody where we can be found around the internet.
We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X at Podcast Stardust.
All right. The dish is aligned. The signal is boosted to maximum output. The shield is down. We are now broadcasting to the galaxy. So why are we doing a rewatch of the Clone Wars? And to that, I say, why not? In actuality, to pull back the curtain, Jay and I are just really, really busy right now.
Yeah.
And the Clone Wars is something we've seen a lot. We've talked about a lot, but we haven't covered all the episodes. So we're going to start this rewatch. I can't say that we're going to do an episode every single week because we might have some other things that we want to talk about. But at least for the next few weeks, we're going to be working our way through the first few episodes of season 1. And I can't wait to get into this, Jay. We've talked about the all of season 7 and then various parts of season 5. And we've covered other episodes, and we may skip those in this rewatch and just air them as bonus episodes or something. So no further ado, let's get into this. And so again, this first one's called Ambush. You want to go ahead and give us the summary of the episode?
Sure. Yeah. And just real quick, Clone Wars is just such comfort Star Wars. You know what I mean? So, what better way to celebrate fandom than going back with a rewatch of the Clone Wars? So here we go. Our summary is as follows. Asajj Ventress crashes a diplomatic meeting between how do you say that? Between King Katunko of Toydaria and Jedi Master Yoda on the dried coral moon of Rugosa. After Dooku, appearing via hologram, fails to convince Katunko to join the Separatists, Asajj proposes a challenge. If she and her battle droids can capture Yoda, then Katunko joins the Separatists. Otherwise, he joins the Republic. Despite Katunko's reluctance, Yoda accepts the challenge. Even though the Separatists vastly outnumber Yoda and his 3 clones, he successfully fights his way to Katunko in time to prevent Asajj from assassinating the king. Katunko then declares that Toydaria would be honored to host a Republic base.
Right, and there you have it, the summary of the very first episode of the Clone Wars. Of course, this did follow the theatrical release of a movie that was patched together from a couple episodes. But as far as the series goes, this is episode 1. So let's kind of talk about this in broad terms and some more specific things as we go. But do you remember what you thought the first time you saw this?
Honestly, no. And when I saw this in the notes, I was trying to rack my brain and think, gosh, when do I remember seeing this? And I was trying to go all the way back to that point in my life. And I know I must have watched it with my then very young children, my 2 boys. And if I remember correctly on Cartoon Network, these came out were they on Friday nights originally, or were they on a different night? Do you remember?
That's a good question. I think I always recorded them. I don't know if I've ever watched these live when they were coming out. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but I just as far as, the rewatch is concerned, the first thing I thought was, "Wow, has this animation come a long way?"
Hmm.
It just really brings you back, and it's a very nostalgic feel and a very nostalgic look, but it still feels like home, I mean, it was
Hmm.
just I feel like I had a smile on my face the entire time watching this particular episode because, quite honestly, I've watched the Clone Wars probably, gosh, at least 3 or 4 times through.
Hmm.
And, sometimes I've started with the first episode, sometimes I start with the way that, it's almost like the same kind of rewatch order that sometimes people give for the movies too, where you start in a different spot. But this one was just great to revisit because I'd kind of forgotten a little bit about it. I mean, I knew that some of the general broad strokes, but not the specifics.
Yeah. So this premiered October 3rd, 2008. And I had very young children at the time, a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. So, it was actually one of my kids was just a few days of shy of being one. And this is, not long after this. This is how I got my kids into Star
Mhm.
Wars. And it was a few episodes later. My oldest didn't start watching it right from the beginning with me, but it was like a month later. But yeah, I would record these because they were like 9 o'clock on Friday nights. It was late, and I had, with young children, had to get kids to bed and things to do, yada yada yada. But you made mention of the quality of the animation. I remember thinking at the time that it was like great. It was fantastic. It rivaled anything else that was animated on TV, or if it was better than a lot of things that were on TV. But it looks very primitive by comparison
Yes.
to season 7 of the Clone Wars, and then what we've just had in the Bad Batch and
Right.
Tales of the Jedi. So it's funny. It was something that I was very pleased with and excited about back in the day. But I watched this and I was like, my God, they've made so many strides
Yeah.
since then. And
Yeah.
I'm sure they can do it, faster, cheaper, and better, no problem compared to then. But
Well, yeah,
um,
it's funny, not to interrupt you, but when you're talking about the primitive nature of this, that's a perfect way to put it, first of all. But, even there was a couple of scenes where, the ships in space were kind of rocking, and it
mhm.
almost looked like they just took the entire, animation cell and just kind of wiggled it. It wasn't,
Right.
it was just, yeah, it was just so choppy in that way. But still, I mean, it was still done so well. I mean, I'm not taking away from it,
Yeah.
at all. But I do remember one thing I do remember, maybe not necessarily about this particular episode,
Mhm.
but just how cool I thought that the little sayings that I then several years later came to understand as fortune cookies
Right.
at the very beginning of each of the episodes. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. So I always used a lot of those. And we were actually just talking about this with Dan Zare on the Phantom Menace segment not too long ago with the quotes. And I used to have a Star Wars quote of the day
Mhm.
whiteboard, and I would use so many of those fortune cookies as like a quote of the day. And so when this one kicked off and it was great leaders inspire greatness in others, I was like, oh yes, there it is. There's that fortune cookie that I know and love.
Right. And then you'd had Tom Kane kinda doing the setup of the episode, of
Yeah,
course,
the
like,
narration, which is so
"It's a
great.
period of war and on the dry coral planet of" I can't do Tom Kane,
So that was pretty good.
this the way he always delivered those kinda like those old serials, and
Right.
that was deliberate by George Lucas,
Oh yeah.
in the style. And that was the other thing, we got to the credits of this, executive produced and created by George Lucas, and
Yes.
Dave Filoni was not even a producer on this at the time. He was the supervising
Mhm.
director of it, which is still a pretty important job, and was very integral to the success of the series. But now he's a producer on everything that comes out Star
Mhm.
Wars wise. Um, One of the things I want to tackle here in this discussion is that stood out to me is that okay, we have the Clone Wars movie. Put that aside for a second. This is one of the first portrayals of the clones and the battle droids that we got outside of the movies,
Right.
and they're quite a bit different than what we saw in the movies. I mean, the clones, for the most part, had no personalities in the movies. They were helmeted warriors. Only briefly did we see them with their helmets off in Revenge of the Sith, right before Obi-Wan flies off to Utapau to find General Grievous. But they didn't have individualized personalities at all then.
Mhm.
Similarly, the battle droids, while they have very similar personalities, they also get personalities in this, and they get deliberate humor
Mhm.
by comparison. If they were funny in the movies, it was not, I don't even know how to phrase it, but not like the slapstick humor so much, or, it was, that does not compute, whatever. And then Qui-Gon slashes it in half, or, they all say Roger, Roger, but then they don't like say something stupid afterwards, and
Right.
meanwhile, in this episode, you had the one battle droid trying to shoot the escape pods and kept missing. And then the other droid is giving him hell for it. Like,
Right.
well, it's my programming. It's, they say these goofy
Mhm.
things, and it's very, very different.
It
Um,
is.
yeah.
And to your point, I think, you pointed out the fact that George Lucas is the producer and everything on this. And I think that that goes back to everything that he's always said about Star Wars is that it's for children. And
Hmm.
that was where the humor for Jar Jar came in. And even though some adults maybe didn't appreciate it, I think this was probably, I'm just reading into this, but maybe this was his opportunity to bring that humor to this animated series in a way that he could do for children,
Hmm.
and that's what the battle droids were kind of reflected on. And even Yoda was very much like his Empire Strikes Back self. He was very playful. I mean, he giggled quite a few times, and
Hmm.
he spoke in certain sorts of riddles, but you just got to feel that he was a lot more lighthearted in this particular episode than we see him generally overall, which I think was really cool. But it's funny that you said that that one battle droid said it's part of my programming,
Hmm.
but then the other, the way that they kind of banter back and forth, how is that their programming? And also the one that ended up going through the coral that didn't follow orders, how is that his programming?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well,
it's like you can't read too far into it, but it's just cute the way that they banter.
I think there is a bit of an in-universe explanation for it. Like, the battle droids we saw during the Phantom Menace didn't have their own independent programming. They were
Mhm.
controlled by the ship in orbit, and when that got blown up, then they were useless. Whereas these battle droids have their own independent processors, and they
Mhm.
aren't tied to that remote control, so they have a little bit more autonomy and can do that. So, okay, I'm being a nerd, but there we go. One of the things I also wanted to talk about here was the setting. This was on the dried moon of Rugosa. It's not actually named in the episode, but if you go to the Star Wars.com and you go to the episode guide, in the stills, it tells you the name of the planet, or the moon, I should say, Rugosa. And it really is this planet that looks like it once was covered in water,
Mhm.
and it grew these enormous coral reefs, and then the water all went away. I thought this environment was brilliant, but what did you think about it?
Oh, yeah, it was beautiful. I mean, just the colors and, just being able to introduce us to yet another type of topography in Star Wars. I think that's one of the ways that Star Wars has always shined, and so it's bringing that, right back.
Yeah, and one other thing that stood out to me is, like, with the exception of some other stuff that we saw, like, think of the worlds that we traditionally see in Star Wars movies: an all desert world,
Mhm.
and all ocean world, Camino,
Right.
and all swamp world, Dagobah.
All
A
jungle.
city in the clouds. For Bespin and stuff like that. And I'm trying to think of the planet's name that Aayla Secura died on in Revenge of the Sith.
Felucia.
But thank you, Felucia. And
Mhm.
but that was a very alien world. This one is like, yeah, and so that's, kind of the exception to the rule. But, most of the point I'm getting at is that most of these planets are, the single environment, but something we're familiar with. Endor is a giant
Mhm.
forest moon,
Mhm.
and, Coruscant is a gigantic city, all around. This is something we don't have
That's a good
on
point.
Earth. This is not an
Yeah.
environment. This is a dried up ocean bed.
Right.
So that
No,
was
that's a
pretty cool
great
of her
point.
as
Yeah, no,
well.
I like that. I like that. One thing too that it kind of hit me is this is the first time that we get to see Asajj Ventress as a character outside of the Tartakovsky Clone Wars.
And of course, the Clone Wars movie, she was a
Right.
part of that as well. Right.
Right.
She was next on my list to talk about.
Mhm.
What do you She was, like, all sweet and demure at the beginning of this episode, and I was like, "Do we ever see her like that again anywhere?"
That's a good question, and I think you're right to point that out because she was, I mean, she was still, sassy as Asajj can be, but she was definitely not as hardened, and I
Mhm.
think some of that also comes from her experiences under Dooku as
Yeah.
well. So, but I think that this is definitely as you said, sort of on that other end of the spectrum. But
Mhm.
I think we're just so used to the quote unquote hairless harpy. You know what I mean? That she
Right.
really got jaded and she really got sarcastic. And maybe this we're catching her at the beginning of her apprenticeship, to Dooku, and she's still, I don't know what the word is, but maybe a little bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
Yeah, I think the other part of that is that I think sarcastic and gruff is who Asajj really is,
Mhm.
but she was in the role of a diplomat here,
Mm,
and so she
mhm,
was doing her best. How many? I don't remember any other opportunity she had to be a diplomat after
mhm.
this, and so she didn't need to put on that face. She didn't need to adopt that act going forward. But it was not until she really got frustrated in the middle of this episode when Yoda and the clones keep destroying more and more of her droids, and she was so confident that they'd be able to capture him that she just drops the act altogether and doesn't even try
Mhm.
anymore. But it was Dooku sent her on this mission, and as Yoda points out at the end, your apprentice has failed, and so maybe that's why she doesn't get any more missions like this because it goes
Yeah.
really badly.
Yes, indeed. And it was also, Yoda kind of throwing it in her face of how bad she was at this too, because he just zipped her lightsabers right out of her hand and then just proceeded to give them right back to her, almost like a slap in the face.
Well, and I love that moment because she says something
Oh
like,
yeah.
"I'll destroy you," and then he snags the lightsabers one. It's like, "Strong in the Force, you are, young one, but not that strong." Just trash
Mhm.
talking her right there, as only Yoda could.
It's almost like, an adult taking away a child's toys after they, threaten to be all
Hmm.
big and bad with them, and then, "Oh, yeah, here you go. Here's your toys back."
Right. So we have the three clones that are with Yoda. We have Reese, Jack, and Thyre. And I have to admit, I had no idea what their names were until I looked them up today, even though I've seen this episode probably a dozen times. Did you know who they were without having to look it up?
No, I mean, Yoda independently addresses each one of them when
Hmm.
he's talking about how they are different in the Force, which is a whole other conversation I'm sure we'll get into. But I didn't retain that information
Yeah,
in my brain, that's for
that's
sure.
basically what I was trying to say. Yeah,
Yeah.
that I knew they were named, but I did not, could not for the life of me remember what those names were.
Mhm.
But what did you think about that? You brought it up. After they've been fighting the battle droids for a while and they've been evading them. One of them, I think it was Thyre, gets injured. His legs get injured, and so they seek refuge in this cave for a rest for a little bit. And he tells them he wants them to take off their helmets so he can see their faces. And they point out, well, there's not really much to see because we all share the same face. And Yoda points out, well, you're all individuals in the Force, and then goes on to complement some characteristic of each one of them and how they can use that. Again, it's kind of getting back to what I was saying earlier. Is that this is where the clones really, this in the movie is where they start to become individuals, even though Star Wars goes out of its way every time to call them clones. Like they have no individuality. They're just like completely, complete photocopies of each other.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, well, for me, of course, I've always had a really big, fandom for clones, especially ever since the Republic Commando book series, which
Hmm.
is not canon, but I've just always been in love with the fact that clones can be individualized and they can be independent people and they're not just like battle droids. And, looking back on this now from a different perspective for Yoda, it almost kind of surprises me in a way that he would humanize them so much because then that only encourages a possible attachment. If you know who the person is under the helmet and you have a little bit more of a vested interest in who they are as a person and as an individual. And not to say that Yoda is, ever been cold and crass and that type of thing towards any of the clones because he's always been, very human towards them, in every way, if you will. But I don't know. I'm kind of torn about that now looking back on it that he preaches no attachments, but then he wants to individualize and know each one of them personally.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I had never thought of that way. I guess I'm kind of reminded of the conversation we just had of Tesseract Temptation of the Force
Hmm.
and how Avar Chris was looking at this concept of love and the love she had for Elzar and how it didn't run afoul of this notion of attachment. And I think there's more nuance to the concept of attachment in Star Wars than just you can't fall in love with somebody.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I still don't entirely, and I haven't had an opportunity to go back and look at it, but I still don't entirely get what Avar Chris was saying about that. But look at the attachment that Anakin formed for Padme. That went well beyond him loving her.
Right.
That became he could not stand to lose her. It was a possessive type of a love. And I don't think that's what Yoda was going for here at all. His point is that you are all beings to be cherished in the Force. And you may have been created for one purpose, which was to fight wars for the Republic, but you all you are individuals worthy of recognition that way.
Mhm.
And I like that message, which is, I think, kind of one of the lessons that this episode was getting at.
Mhm. Oh, for sure. And especially for children watching this is just to be able to celebrate your value as an individual and your contributions as such. So I get what Yoda was doing and I get, where that lesson is definitely coming from. And it does, I mean, let's face it, when I don't care who you are, if you're a clone or if you're just a person on the street, if someone values you as an individual, you're going to want to do your job better.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely. Well, because they didn't come out and say this, I should say. But Clone Wars, I feel like in the early going was a different show than it was in the end, where it kind of grew up with its audience a bit.
Mhm.
But these clones, without saying it, were ready to sacrifice themselves for the mission, for Yoda to complete the mission. And he points out at one point, like, no one gets left behind. Left behind, no one is, or something like that. I can't remember exactly how he said it, but that is part of the clone programming. It's all about the mission, and he taught them to find value in themselves. And after he goes out and challenges the droid battalion single-handedly, and tells them, hey, you'll know when the time is right to help me, and they launch the rocket, destroy the droid, because they admit that, hey, we all learned something today about this. And so anyways, I think that's a great message of the episode.
Mhm.
um we got about a little less than 10 minutes for this discussion left. Did you have any other favorite moments from this episode?
Well, I just like the way that Yoda was able to use the Force, and I do think that this was a nicely paced action episode for sure. Between the droid battalions and just coming one after another. It was almost like they started with their lowest ranks,
Mm-hmm.
the poor battle droids, and then they would send out the super battle droids, and then they'd send out the droidicas. And I did catch one of the super battle droids saying something very similar to what poor C-3PO said in Attack of the Clones, where it said, "Die Republic dogs" instead
Mm-hmm.
of "Die Jedi dogs." So I thought that was a nice little throwbacky kind of a touch too. But I did like seeing the action of Yoda, doing his thing. So I thought that was a lot of fun.
This episode has one of my favorite funny moments from all of Star Wars in it, and that is when Asajj Ventress is getting frustrated, and King Katunko is kind of ribbing her about, he'd already said that, from what he understood, one Jedi is worth 100 battle droids. But the fight's going on off in the distance, and he says something to Asajj, it's like, yeah, that's an awful lot of smoke for a surrender. And she pulls out her little holo transmitter, and it's like, 244, come in. What is going on? And all of a sudden a battle droid shows up and says, 244 has been destroyed, Supreme Leader. The Jedi is, and then all of a sudden you see Yoda jump on one hand and then slice his head off. Just that shriek, as he's just so matter of factly trying to report what Yoda is doing, completely ignoring the fact that Jedi just jumped in his hand. Just I laugh every single time I see that one.
That is
It
a good
was,
one.
yeah, that's one of my favorite moments from across Star Wars for that reason.
Oh, that's
Um,
great. Yeah.
yeah,
The
and
battle
then
droids just go ahead.
I was gonna say, and then of course the one that we already talked about with Yoda trash talking Asajj, strong in the Force you are, little one, but not that strong. It's just, you could see that little grin on his face when he tossed her lightsabers back to her.
So classic. Yeah, no,
Mhm.
I was just gonna say that the battle droids are always good for a laugh. I mean, there was the one that said, "I just got promoted." And then
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm good with that now, but back in the day, I kind of found that grating.
oh,
The
no.
the battle droid humor in this because it was just like,
Uh-huh.
I don't know you need to do that with them. But like I said earlier, I think it goes to, just like how in the movies, the battle droids, they all look the same. They're faceless, completely fungible. One was good as the other. The Clone Wars are as that way as too. But now here in the Clone Wars, we see that they all do have their own independent personalities. We get to know and love a bunch of different clones. We don't follow any battle droids like that in the Clone Wars.
Right.
Mr. Bones and the Aftermath novel kind of humanizes the clones a bit more,
Exactly.
but they do adopt characteristics that deviate from that whole faceless, nameless enemy that we got to see in the movies.
Mhm. Mhm. It's true. That's true. And I did notice too that they were calling Asajj Supreme Leader.
Yeah, yeah. It clearly does not mean the same things it does for the First Order. So,
Exactly.
but
Exactly.
I'm not sure if George Lucas would have used that title if he made the sequels, but all right.
Yes.
Okay. Well, then that was fun. I'm glad we got to discuss that episode. I'm looking forward to getting into episode 2 next week.
For
But
sure.
just want to say thank you all for joining us for this episode of Podcast Stardust as we get into our rewatch of the Clone Wars. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any episodes of that, then of course hit subscribe to the Podcast Stardust on your podcatcher of choice. You know how to do that. We're available pretty much anywhere. And if we aren't, let me know what podcatcher you're looking for us on, and I'll see about getting us added to that feed. And I'd also like to remind you, you can find all episodes of the show over at retrozapp.com, which is home to the Retrozap Podcast Network and other great shows like the Dunecast, Enjoy Stuff, my Star Trek podcast, Warp Trails, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, and shows like Superhero Suite. We are always on the lookout for ratings and reviews on your podcatcher choice, especially if that's Apple Podcasts. It's a great way of helping others find the show and getting us noticed. And the other thing you can do to help us out is share the show on social media with your friends. So now that I suggested that, Jay, tell them how they can do it.
Sure, there's plenty of places where you can do that. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X at Podcast Stardust. You can also check out our plethora of Pinterest boards and get some fun ideas over there. And we are also on both of the YouTube outlets, so the traditional YouTube as well as YouTube Music. So head over to both of those, like, subscribe, and share those out. And those do support comments and interactions and reviews as well. So we'd love to see it. Another place we'd love to see you is over on our Discord room, which is part of the RetroZap Discord server. So if you're up for some real time chatter, you can hit up the link in our show notes there. And another link that you can head to is our TeePublic store, where you can purchase one of 7 different show logo designs that are available on tons of different products from home goods and apparel and pretty much everything in between. And each one of those purchases does help to support the show. And another way that you can support the show is by heading over to Saber Masters. So if you are in need of a lightsaber, especially if Yoda takes yours, you can pick out one of lots of different battle ready lightsabers available over on sabermasters.com. And again, you can hit up that link in our show notes. And if you do happen to get anything, make sure you put the link Stardust, or I'm sorry, the code Stardust in at checkout, and that will get you an extra $10 off. So, Dennis, why don't you fill everybody in on what other kind of project stuff you got going on, including any new updates on other podcasting adventures or the like?
Right. So my wife Beth and I host a Star Trek podcast called Warp Trails. It's devoted to the shows that have been coming out on Paramount Plus. So that would be Discovery, Lower Decks, Picard, and Strange New Worlds. We are not putting any episodes out right now because there isn't any new Star Trek. But when Lower Decks comes back in October, we'll be covering it then. So if you want to check out some of our past content, the best place you can do that right now is at retrozap.com. But otherwise, you can find us on the RetroZap podcast feed. Jay, what do you got going on in cosplay?
Well, right now, a little quiet on the cosplay front, but you can always catch everything that I do over on my Instagram, which is at j.snipscosplay. So I am Ahsoka from the Clone Wars, seasons 3 through 5, as well as 2 different versions of Hera, one from Rebels and one from the Ahsoka series, as well as the Fourth Sister Inquisitor from the Kenobi series, as well as my original concept Mandalorian based on Tahiri Vela from Legends. And currently, my calendar is starting to fill up for September and October. And and I have a few things in the works. And as soon as I get those all nailed down, I will be sure to share those. But until that time, you can check it out at j.snips cosplay.
All right. Upcoming on the show on Wednesday, we're going to try something new. It's called Ask Me Anything About Star Wars. And so Jay and I are going to be asking us some Star Wars related questions, and you're to see how that goes. So make sure you check that out. Then on Friday, it is our weekly look at Star Wars news. So with that, thanks for listening to episode 767 of Podcast Stardust. Have a great rest of your week. And until next time, may the Force be with you.